Deep state trying to shut us down. But that's all right because we're back. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard this afternoon's edition of Posto Nation. I do not know what happened right there. We got cut off, but now we have returned. To recap, the Secretary of the Navy, acting Secretary of the Navy, has resigned. President Trump yesterday said that he was going to get involved, and get involved he did. So now the Secretary of the Navy, who fired Captain Crozier, has himself stepped down from his position as Secretary of the Navy. So the Secretary of the Navy lied. We already know that he's not credible in this situation. He did not afford Captain Crozier the benefit of an investigation. Instead, he removed him from his position at the head of an aircraft carrier in the middle of a national emergency. At a time, by the way, when his men and women, the people of that ship, were in harm's way. Because you got to understand, the aircraft carrier, it's not the Diamond Princess, okay? This isn't something where you can quarantine in confined spaces, right? Everything's open. It's all open bay. You're talking bunk beds, 80 people to a room, open spaces in terms of where you eat, in terms of where you sleep, in terms of the bathrooms. Okay, it's all open, it's all shared. There's no private space on an aircraft carrier or essentially any ship in the Navy. When it comes down to it, it's just going to be a different scale. But an aircraft carrier happens to be 5,000 people. If you go all the way back to the original day that I started talking about this, I said that the easiest answer here, the easiest solution, and this is what I called for, by the way, this is all I called for. I said, we need to take care of the people. We can deal with any investigation later, right, to figure out what exactly happened. But put the men and women on the hangar, the B-52 hangar, that's available at the northern end of Guam Island on Andersen Air Force Base. So get the Secretary of Defense involved, and he should have had the Secretary of the Navy talk to the Secretary of the Air Force, figure out a way to clear some space for quarantine hangar on one of those hangars, allow it to be put in. And by the way, this is the same precedent that was followed when Kurdish refugees, all right, from the Gulf War were brought to Guam before they were brought to the United States. Because the issue is, when it comes to coronavirus, you don't want to create an outbreak across the entire island of Guam. You don't want to overextend the medical facilities there. Remember, flatten the curve goes for anywhere you're at, right? So it's kind of an issue too when people talk about sort of the rural parts of the United States. You have to deal with rural infrastructure and rural medicine out there. They're not going to, yes, they do have less density in terms of the population, but they also don't typically have the same level of access to medical care and hospitals as people who do in the larger cities. Okay, you understand the difference? And so now there's a reason that the sailors of that aircraft carrier stood and gave a standing ovation to Captain Crozier because he stood up for them. All right. Regardless of how the letter was leaked, the fact that he wrote the letter meant that he was standing up for them. All right. And I don't know, right? I don't know what the entire situation was. I've talked to my sources in the Navy that I can't reveal because it would show you how close I am to this. But I can tell you there's a lot more to this story than what Mobley was saying. Because if you put his statements up, and I'll just go leave it at that. If you put his daily statements up on a timeline basis of everything that he said on every day that he said it. Remember, after the letter came out, his first response was that there would be no retaliation. And he praised Captain Crozier for doing the right thing. And he said, we would want all of our commanding officers across the Navy to act in this manner if their men and women were in harm's way. That's what he said. Okay, so the guy is completely, it's called a lack of candor, right? It's called a lack of candor in military parlance. It's, we can't trust his statements because they keep changing from day 1 to day 2 to day 3. We can't change it. And the fact that it became so public is obviously a huge issue. Now, how much of that is on Captain Crozier? That remains to be seen. But as someone who is the captain of an aircraft carrier, which, by the way, an aircraft carrier is just about as significant as a representation of the United States government, the United States people, the United States sovereignty as we have. This is our most expensive and one of our most powerful military assets in our entire arsenal. It is the image of American, what's called force projection around the world. That's what it's for. All right, that's what it's for. That's why we have all 12 of them. That's right there. So when you're placed as the commanding officer of one of those things, you have a record that is without blemish. All right, you are the top of the top. And being one of the O6s that's given command over one of those ships, all right, one of these floating cities as they're known, is typically seen as being on the fast track to becoming an admiral, right? So an admiral is the next step up from a captain. You're an O6 captain, then you become this rear admiral lower half, rear admiral upper half, vice admiral admiral. So it's 1 star to 4 stars. So your first star would come after being a captain. I'm trying to break this down in sort of normie language so that people who aren't prior Navy or prior service can follow along. But what the Secretary of the Navy did was not only fire him, he decided to add insult to injury by then going himself all the way from Washington, D.C. to Guam to berate the sailors, to admonish them, to scold them in a profanity-laced meltdown that even though they were the ones in harm's way, that they were the ones doing something wrong, and that he made himself, if you go back and look at his transcript, he made himself out to be the victim of their criticism. It's incredible. It's an incredible situation when you look at this. Moodley tried to make himself the victim and put our sailors, who understandably have family members that are worried sick about them, all right, after he publicly made an acknowledgement that there was an outbreak of coronavirus, an outbreak, by the way, which has obviously been downplayed, because if Captain Crozier himself, who has been tested positive for coronavirus, has it, then that seems to tell me that there's probably quite a few people out of that 5,000 that also already have it. In fact, one of the issues that came up in that letter was that their testing was inadequate. The initial tests that were put out throughout the Teddy Roosevelt were inadequate, and there were people that had been brought off the ship that had tested negative originally that were then retested and came up positive. And we all know that there's been issues with testing throughout the United States government response to this. And I absolutely, by the way, also say that there should, just for the record, that there absolutely has to be an accounting of this, what went wrong with the CDC, what went wrong with the FDA, why were private laboratories not allowed, Quest Diagnostics, etc., Abbott Labs, why were they not allowed to roll out tests from the start when we knew the CDC test was faulty? Why did the administrative state, the bureaucracy of the United States, fail the American people? This system, right, that prevents outbreaks in the United States and responds to them, it should operate on autopilot. This shouldn't be something that we rely on any one president or any one politician for. It's a system that should operate in terms of tripwires, okay? If we detect something that's running throughout our population, whether that population be anywhere in the United States, whether it be airports, whether it be Seattle, New York, Chicago, Houston, New Orleans, etc., or Des Moines, Iowa, regardless of it hitting our fleet and hitting our sailors or our soldiers in the Army, our Marines, the Air Force, the Space Force, right? Got to say Space Force now, the Coast Guard. The CDC should jump into action. Fort Detrick should immediately activate their protocols for this. It shouldn't matter who the president is. You shouldn't have to give an order for this, okay? It's like Benghazi. When Benghazi was under attack and the ambassador was under attack, you don't have to order the Army or the Marine Corps Quick Response Force to go save the ambassador. It's just automatic. It's an automatic action, all right? It's a tripwire. It's a tripwire. It shouldn't matter who the president is. It shouldn't matter who any of these politicians are, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Navy, etc. Right? This should all be done automatically. And the only thing that they should be able to do is to come in and press the pause button if they need to at some point. And if they do, then they better have a darn well good reason for doing so. All right? Right. And I see a lot of people in the comments parroting okay, the spin, right? Because there's so much spin on this, because y'all are just listening to government propaganda and you're not actually looking at the facts. The Navy has no information that Captain Crozier leaked this to newspapers. Full stop. The standard was, oh, the newspaper that put it out was the same one that he happens to be from? Are you serious? What kind of standard is that? That's not a legal standard. Show me any court in the United States that would use that as a standard. All right? Correlation is not causation. Okay, so stop. Just stop with the propaganda, because you don't know. You literally don't know. But what you do know is that there's a massive PR crisis created by Secretary Modly that handed an incredible propaganda coup to the Chinese. Okay, you gave the Chinese the ability to turn around and say, look, think about it. What had been the United States up to this number one criticism of China? The United States' number one criticism of China was that China went after whistleblowers early on during the Wuhan virus outbreak. All right? Yet how can we criticize the Chinese government if we are going after Navy captains who are then seen as whistleblowers for writing letters about the condition of their people? So now of course the Chinese are going to turn around and say, see, you did the same thing. You did the same thing. You gave them Secretary Modly, because he refuses to understand the ideals of fourth generation warfare, or 4D warfare, as I call it in my book. He refuses to learn these things. He refuses to learn the doctrine put out by Lind on this. He refuses to understand the strategic situation that he's in, the strategic value to the Chinese of his decisions and his missteps, and understanding that perception is reality. Perception is reality, dude. So if you're going to go up there and be one of those Pharisees and just say, well, I think that a rule was broken, and so I'm just going to start firing people left and right, and I'm going to fly all the way to an aircraft carrier on the other side of the planet. It's a 14-hour flight, by the way, to Guam. I'm going to scream at people for standing up for their commanding officer, because when you have a bond with a commanding officer, when you have a good commanding officer, that's the old man. That's the skipper of your ship. That's someone you trust. That's someone that you put, when you're a sailor and you have a commanding officer, a good one, you put your life in their hands. Every single day when you're out there patrolling the Western Pacific, Chinese submarines, who knows how close they are? Russian submarines, if you're close to North Korea, etc. You are in harm's way, because everybody knows that the U.S. aircraft carrier is our most viable naval asset. It is our most powerful naval asset. It is our biggest target as well. Right? These things aren't exactly maneuverable. So your life is literally in their hands. And because he disrespected the relationship that those Navy sailors had for their commanding officer, because he disrespected those Navy sailors, and quite frankly, disrespected that captain. All right, so and even if you play devil's advocate and take as a letter of faith, because again, you have no proof because you didn't even give him the benefit of an investigation. If you take it as a letter of faith, an article of faith, that he did somehow play a role in the leak, which again hasn't been proven, then shouldn't the punishment fit the crime? All right, there's easy ways that you could have dealt with this in-house, as it's called in the military. Keep everything under wraps so that we don't look like we have, like the entire United States military, the entire United States Navy has their butt hanging out in front of the Chinese. Right? You want to reassign him to a Navy-wide COVID-19 response task force. All right, so now he's been reassigned, but it kind of looks like something different than a firing. Do you get how that works? Do you understand how that doesn't give the Chinese a propaganda coup? Do you understand how that would have looked a whole lot differently? But because you, Secretary Modly, mismanaged the situation, and then you doubled down on it and just looked stupid. You looked like a whiny little pissant when you flew out there and started screaming about rules and regulations and how you were really the victim and it's the sailors who were wrong. It's like that meme, right? From The Simpsons. Did the children have a point? Oh, no, wait. Could they have a point? No, it's not me. It's the children who are wrong. And that's what you look like. This is every stereotype of Beltway brass gone wrong. And by the way, even Admiral Stavridis, who is one of the most distinguished and respected retired Navy admirals in the entire service that we still have around. I mean, Stavridis, his name is up there, easily with any, almost at the level of any of the wartime admirals, just the legendary admirals like Nimitz, okay? And even Stavridis said that something went absolutely wrong here in how this was dealt with. Yeah, it is very complex. It is very complex. And I appreciate the comments that are understanding that, because the military is a very complex organization. It's a very large organization, and you have to play various roles at the same time. You have to weigh the counterbalances, the trade-offs of what your actions, all right, of what your actions are and the ramifications of those actions going forward. Interestingly enough, the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Did you know? Did you know? 1898, we're going all the way back, 1898, during the Spanish American War, there was an Army officer who was sent to Cuba to fight the Spanish, help live, and then wrote a letter about an outbreak of yellow fever and malaria that had struck the island and had put the soldiers in his command, the cavalry at that point, in his command, at danger. Now, it's because of the political ramifications. They thought that if an army unit was seen as leaving Cuba, that would potentially mean that the United States was ceding Cuba and was not going to, maintain their claim there in the Caribbean. That letter was later leaked to the Associated Press, made its rounds. It's now is known as the round robin letter of the Spanish-American War. Do you know the name of that Army officer who wrote the famous round robin letter from Cuba about the outbreak of malaria and yellow fever? Well, I'll tell you. The name of that officer was Theodore Roosevelt. The same Theodore Roosevelt later rose through the ranks and was elected President of the United States, and the same Theodore Roosevelt that the aircraft carrier itself is named after. So, folks, there's been a lot of tension, and there's always tension between the Beltway brass and commanders in the field. There's constant tension between the Beltway, sort of the people in DC, the Alexander Vindmans of the world, if you will, and the people who are actually in harm's way, and what they have to go through and what they have to deal with on a regular basis. It's very easy to say, well, we've taken your concerns into consideration, but we are looking at the rules, and the rules say that we can do whatever we want, and so we're not going to listen to you. Bully! In this case, the concerns of the 5,000 men and women on that aircraft carrier, on board that aircraft carrier, went ignored. And Captain Crozier wrote a letter standing up for them. I don't know how it was leaked. I hope there's a thorough investigation into finding out exactly what happened there and how that made its way to the San Francisco Chronicle. I would call for that. However, the way that Navy Secretary Modly handled himself in this was completely unprofessional, was completely inappropriate, and completely unbecoming. That's the word I was trying to say there. I was saying inappropriate and unbecoming at the same time, so it became inappropriate. Unbecoming of a leader of the United States military. And yes, he is a civilian leader. But it looks to me that President Trump, who was asked about this situation yesterday at the press conference, if you remember, he said, you know what? I'm going to look into this because I don't think a man's life should be destroyed over one bad day. Isn't that an amazing statement from our president? And isn't that an amazing statement for Holy Week? Because we understand the importance of atonement. We understand the importance of forgiveness. We understand the importance of second chances. All right. This is something that President Trump has made part and parcel of his administration, of saying nobody is perfect. You're not going to find a perfect person. And I say that you never find perfection outside of Christ Jesus. You just don't. But I do think that something that President Trump finds very important is that people are treated fairly. And that he wants to see people treated fairly throughout the country. That's why he's pushed forward on the First Step Act. And I know there's a lot of criticism of the First Step Act and is it doing the things that it set out to do? And, we obviously have to take a look at that and make sure that only the right people are being covered by it. And if there's people that deserve to stay behind bars, then they deserve to stay behind bars. But the point of it is that people shouldn't be judged on the basis of one mistake. And as Christians, we look to that. And as this is Holy Week, I would remind everybody that it was the Pharisees, the people who stood on the letter of the law, that sent Jesus to be crucified, not those who understood the spirit of the law. Acting Secretary of the Navy Modly has resigned. Jack Posobiec reminding you once again that you have my permission to lay ashore.